Hey, what's going on everyone? My name is Seth Miranda, this is AdoramaTV, and I recently got a chance to try out the new Nikon Z6III. This is the latest addition to the next generation of the Nikon Z series. We're looking at an evolution of the Z6 II in almost a complete redesign. So stick with me on this. You're gonna see a lot of similarities in the specs coming from the Z9, Z8, ZF over into Z6 series. And it's really nice to see here. And I think we've all been waiting for this to come to fruition, and it's here now. So what are we getting here? Well, let's go over this one at a time. First of all, we got the new processor, the Nikon XP7, which gives you all that new processing power for faster frame rates, the autofocus, the newer menus, the new platform that you've been seeing in the Z9, Z8, ZF. Now we're seeing in the Z6 series. But I think the crazier thing to explain to you guys is probably the new sensor. Yeah, I know, it's 24.5 megapixels like we were similar to in the Z6, Z6 II, and maybe some of you were looking for a higher resolution there, but what they gave us was more speed, a faster readout with what they're calling a partially stacked sensor. What does that even mean? So you have sensors that are just standard sensors, BSI, backside illuminated, which is what's been in the Z6 and Z6 II. And then you have stacked, fully stacked, which is what you see in the Z8 and Z9. So in the middle there, they decided to come up with this partially stacked sensor, which gives you some benefits of the faster readout that you see in a stacked sensor. But I think they're able to keep the cost down with it not being fully stacked and still being a full frame camera. This is cool. This means that you're gonna see a lot less motion distortion out there when your shots with electronic shutter, or even some jello happening with your pan shots and stills and video. Great to see. And you're getting that speed, and the 24 megapixels keeps it at a nice point to give you a good resolution, that really great image quality that you're probably used to out of the Z6 and Z6 II, but now you're getting that faster readout and that lower light capability, because they're claiming up to -10 EV autofocus in this thing. And with our application of shooting at Gleason's gym here in Brooklyn, New York, one of the oldest boxing gyms that we've got here, with low light, I'm gonna go over that whole scenario in a minute, but let's keep going through some of these specs so you can understand what happened when we took it into the field for a couple hours. When I say it's a kind of complete redesign, I really mean that. When you look at the ports, you have a full-size HDMI instead of the HDMI mini. It's a little bit bigger of a body design, which shows me that they're thinking about things like heat dissipation for longer run times with video and other applications. So as far as the size of it goes, it fits right in between a Z6 II and a Z8. Right in the middle is really where you're seeing the body design. In fact, when I saw it sitting there, I kind of thought it was a Z8 for a split second by the shape and ratio of the size kind of feeling. But then once I picked up, I realized, oh wait, the dial in the back is different, stuff like that, but it does make you think it's right there in the middle of the Z6 II and the Z8 if you want to get a sense of what it'll feel like in hand. One of the biggest changes you're going to see is the flip out screen. No more tilt. It's going to be a complete flip out, which is nice for video applications, or if you want to self film, you can see yourself. And I know a lot of people are hoping that would come to some of the Z series, and you're getting that here in the Z6 III, and it's very video minded, giving you up to 6K 60 frames per second in this. Plus you're getting 4K 120 that is cropped to DX, but they are giving you 1080 240 frames for slow-mo as well, which is nice to see. I mean, they really gave you a lot of video functionality in this, including two types of RAW, NRAW and ProRes HQ in camera. You're able to shoot RAW into this little camera, which is pretty awesome to see. And when you get all that video functionality with the flip screen, you start seeing that they really looked at this to be more of a versatile tool, as opposed to just maybe a stills camera that has great video capability. You're getting it kind of all in this package right here. Now, as far as harping back on the low light, with the -10 EV autofocus, and then you mix in the 24 megapixel sensor, Nikon was basically saying, like, go ahead and push the ISO. We want to see what this thing looks like noise-wise. You're gonna go put it to the test. And I was pretty skeptical, to be honest with you. So when we went over to Gleason's gym, it was low light. I'm not kidding you. The images that I shot were almost all shot at 8000 ISO at f2. I was using the 85mm 1.2 lens because I love that lens. I think it focuses fast, and I just wanted to get a lens that could open up if I needed to, but I didn't want to be too open because I didn't want to have, you know, no depth of field between two guys sparring at each other. And this wasn't an easy situation, right? I wanted to make sure that I didn't get motion blur, so I kept the shutter speed north of 1600th of a second, somewhere around there. And like I said, 8000 ISO, so you're looking at the image quality here. But you're getting 20 frames per second raw, just like you see in the Z9 Z8. At 24.5 megapixels, you're getting that frame rate, which is cool, and it's keeping up with it. I'm saying that in this really difficult situation where I was having flickering old lights in there, I was having low light, I was having mixed temperatures, all sorts of weirdness, I was getting some really nice results. And don't forget, I'm shooting through ropes. They have big gloves that are constantly flying in front of their face. They had headgear on that kept obscuring their face. And I found that the autofocus was not only finding their face, but staying with the eye. I basically put it on wide large so that I had a big box that I just kind of tapped left to right, and it would grab the fighter that I wanted to grab on the fly instead of having just 3D autofocus on a small point. I just kept knocking it back and forth and letting the camera do the work. And to my surprise, it stayed with them pretty well in this low lit, very obscured situation for the subjects. I was pretty happy with it. It was really nice to see this thing perform at such a level in this type of condition. And don't forget, this is pre-production. This is beta firmware. This isn't even finished yet, so it can only get better from here. And Nikon has been showing a lot of support firmware-wise for the entire setup of the Z series, and especially anything with an Speed 7 processor on it. And keep in mind, like I said, I was at 8,000 ISO for most of these shots. I kept on keeping the shutter speed higher than I normally would because I didn't want to get motion blur confuse me for missing focus. I wanted to see how this camera performed, right? And yes, I was at f2 because I didn't want to be too shallow when I'm shooting with two fighters. I just wanted to make sure that with the headgear on, I was still getting enough depth of field for the eye and some of the actual facial features that you might be seeing and things like that. But being between shutter speeds is really what kind of helped me out here with the flickering lights in the ceiling. I'm not kidding you. This is one of the oldest gyms here in Brooklyn. You're looking at different temperatures of light, different bulbs, manufacturers, types. Not only were they flickering, but some were dimmer than others. It was all over the place, and that's what you're probably gonna deal with out there. I'm sure some of you know what it's like to shoot in those weird high school gyms that have all sorts of light sources, but I was able to use the high frequency flicker reduction, which is nice to see in a camera like this. So I was actually between shutter speeds. Usually I was starting at 12/50th of a second, going around, 1600th of a second, but I was actually like 1620.37th of a second because it could do it. I was just dialing in a shutter speed that would get that flicker off my back so I could shoot the 20 frames per second at the higher ISOs. And you're looking at the image quality right now, which I think it did a pretty good job, all things considered, including that autofocus in this low light situation that was still tracking faces that were obscured with stuff in the foreground, with moving subjects, all sorts of stuff. So I gotta say, I think it did pretty well, but you're looking at the shots right now. We tried a bunch of stuff here as far as not just ambient light, because I wanted to shoot this as if you would be in a boxing gym. I know a lot of you would be like, you're not gonna set up strobes. I can't set up strobes for shooting that type of sport, and I get you, so I wanted to be as authentic as I could with that. But then we went towards the back of the gym, and I wanted to see what this looked like at clean 100 ISO. And so we went there. We looked at where we could set up. This was the fastest, sloppiest lighting I've done in a while. Lay off me on that, but just give you a sense of what it would look like in more of a studio sort of type application. I gave these two amazing fighters some portraits for themselves with a red gel on the back, a blue gel on the back to separate the two fighters, like feel of their portraits, and just getting in there with some small Profoto A2 lights in there. This camera isn't just meant for fast frame rates. They also gave you a nice top-end shutter speed of 1/16,000th of a second, which is nice to see. Usually you only get to about 8,000th of a second. Really good to see that there, especially if you're gonna be shooting action. You might want that extra headroom on the faster shutter speed. And one of the things I noticed heavily with shooting this camera was the viewfinder. You were looking at an exponentially higher res viewfinder than you've seen in other Z cameras at 5.7 million dot, and it seems brighter. I asked them about that. They said, yes, it should be a brighter viewfinder experience if you need that. If you're someone that shoots out there in the sun, you've been saying, man, I just want a brighter viewfinder, this is kind of it. But what was surprising, and I saw on the spec sheet, was it has Apple P3 color space in there, which means it's closer to what you're gonna be looking at on the screen you're gonna be editing in, which is really nice to see. It shows that they're thinking about the user and how they're gonna be using this camera. And I will also say that while I wasn't shooting at a slower shutter speed, having used the Z6, the Z6II, this does feel like just an improved IBIS. It felt like the stabilization on this camera, just something got added to it. And if they're saying that in the specs, I'm gonna say in a user case, I felt it, okay? And that comes into play heavily with something like video. Now you're gonna be looking at this camera, be able to switch between doing 20 frames per second raw files and then click right into doing 6K, 60 frames per second raw if you want, which is pretty awesome in something like this. So you're looking at kind of a rethinking, redesign of this whole thing, but giving you enough of a caveat to get the price to a point where it can get accessible to people's hands. Maybe you're not in the budget for a flagship, but you can get the speed of that. And the 24 megapixel, I think it's a good trade-off instead of getting like 30 megapixels or whatever people are hoping for, because that's if I wanted to crop by chance. Having noise control at higher ISOs is more important to me because that's something I can't control, but I can always kind of step in closer, use different lenses, stuff like that. But 24 megapixels is a lot of resolution, and this camera's handling it pretty well. You still have the mixed card slots, CV Express Type B and SD, so keep that in mind. But overall, this camera felt like they looked at the Z6 II, they looked at their flagship and said, what can we bring into this and still make it accessible? So you've got new sensor technology with the partially stacked sensor, you've got the new processor with the XPEED 7, and you've got the flip out screen, the new EVF. I mean, the list of new goes on and on, but I'm gonna say that this thing feels like they really looked at it as a low light beast kind of. They gave you more resolution than you would probably need for something to get to web, but if you're shooting like press, events, weddings, something like that, where you need autofocus to be there in low light, where you want noise to be, kind of have a solution for that when you're in low light, it's kind of there for me. I think that that's really where this camera really fits in, and it might be a great second camera for a lot of Z shooters out there in general. And of course, it's Z mount. You've got all that amazing Z glass out there to work with. There will be an optional battery grip for this camera if you do want to get a vertical grip for it. They will be introducing that as well. And I'm curious to see where it goes from here. Like I said, Nikon's doing amazing things with firmware. We'll see what goes on with that. I definitely want to get this back in my hand later on so that I can see what the actual production firmware is like in an actual production unit. But you're looking at shots from this Gleason's gym, and you're looking at shot after shot after shot of gloves and headgear obscuring faces and staying with those fighters, and the 20 frames per second is nice to have as well. So I think overall it did a pretty good job. You let me know what you think, but if you guys want to know anything specific about the actual specs, hardcore data, check out the links down below for all of that. If you guys want to ask me any questions about my really short use case with this camera, hit me with a comment down below. I'll do my best to answer it as always. Don't forget to like, share this video around, hit subscribe and the bell to get notified when we put up more videos like this. We'll see you next time. Later.